Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Policy Podcast. My name is Herath, and together with my colleague Florence, we are so delighted to welcome Hannah Ferguson to the podcast today. Hannah is the co-founder and CEO of Cheek Media, the Australian platform reshaping how people engage with politics and culture. She's the co-host of the news and pop culture podcast, Big Small Talk, and the best-selling author of 2 books, Bite Back and Taboo. A lawyer by training with a Bachelor of Laws with honours and a Masters of Writing, so accomplished. She is one of Australia's most distinctive voices on media, politics and social change, and we are thrilled to have her with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Hannah.
Thank you for having me. 3 Australians at Oxford right now is hilarious to be on a podcast. So sorry for the accent, the jarring nature, bro.
Or understand per se, actually. That's about that.
Hannah, the first thing we want to talk about today is sort of where it all began. You've created a really distinctive voice in Australian political media. So if you could take us back to the beginning, what gap did you see in the way that politics was being communicated, and what made you choose to fill that gap with sort of social media, podcasting, those types of tools?
Well, it's interesting actually, because when I started my undergrad law degree at the University of Queensland, I was doing a double with journalism. And I remember getting through the first semester and thinking, what a ridiculous set of assessments. I'm dropping this. I'm not going to be a journalist. I'm never going to use this. I'll just get to the law degree quicker. That'll be more effective. But it's actually now ironic to my career and where I've ended up, because the reason I sort of wanted to challenge the legal system through media was because as a law undergrad at UQ, I looked around in the law classroom that I occupied and saw a really narrow view of the world and the people who would shape that world. So it was, lots of young men and women who had private school education, who had parents who were barristers or judges, who had experience in the field, and who were just pressurized to kind of follow on in those footsteps. But knowing that those were the people that would ultimately sort of make up the rule makers of society in many ways, in different institutional pathways, but that they would ultimately govern those that they have no idea or concept of the world experience of, the worldview of, was frightening to me. Again, I'm a white woman. I come from, a middle-class background. Like, I am not privileged in many ways. I have a lot of privilege, but I still understood the gap between myself and this group of people that kind of dominated law school. And so I made it my goal to kind of go into different environments and say, okay, well, how could I have an impact in the legal field in a different way? So I went and volunteered at a prisoner's legal service. I went to prisons in Queensland and helped inmates apply for parole. I did lots of different things in my time at law school. I went and worked in public prosecutions. I worked in health regulation. I tried to do lots of things to kind of see where I could fit. And I was, I couldn't figure it out. But the more that I realized I had come from a kind of conservative small town background, the more that I thought, actually, one of my skill sets here is having the communication skills to speak about legal systems, to unpack them, to make them digestible for people that are outside of this space. And so I started an Instagram account, which is outrageous. When you think about that as a 22-year-old, it's like, oh, I'm going to make social change Instagram account. It feels a bit silly until it doesn't, basically. And now Cheek reaches 4 million Australians each month. But the idea started with myself and 2 co-founders. It's now just me and a team that I employ, which I'm so excited by after 5 years. But really this idea of, okay, how can we make progressive ideas an open forum public square rather than exclusionary club? And how can we actually reshape media for youth that is accessible and entertaining in some ways and stimulating? We wanted it to be something people wanted to engage in because they got something out of it. And so it's really shaped by a lot of different perspectives I held about how to repackage and explain these difficult ideas.
That's so fascinating. And I think actually brings me to the next question, which is, I think your audience is fascinating. Like you say, it's mostly young people, it's mostly women, mostly progressive voters. Are these actually young Australians who have already been engaged in politics to some extent and have just maybe not found the platform through traditional politics? Or do you think you're bringing in new people to the fold?
What's also really interesting is that I say young people because, I'm 27, I'm Gen Z, and it is mostly people that, are my age group, my demographic. But what's fascinating is that the Murdoch media really positions me as like a Gen Z magnet. And actually, I don't think Gen Z think I'm very cool at all, because I have more followers over the age of 50 than under the age of 25.
Wow.
And I think that's so fascinating because, again, I don't talk about it that much, but I think that speaks to the fact that, especially in Australian politics over the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a real shift away from the major parties. And a lot of women over the age of 50, so in Australia, we have like a community independent movement where it's largely dominated by women who are finding new spaces in Australian politics through independent mechanisms and funding. And their voter base is older Australian women who are fed up with the political systems that have ignored their vote for a really long time. And so it's so interesting because Cheek Media offers this progressive space for young people. And then there's also this comforting space, I think, for older people that are frustrated and sick of the establishment. And I love that so much because I think it speaks to the fact that there are generational divides that can be bridged and that we can create conversations in a new public square that isn't defined by I'm a young woman, therefore I am only received by young women. Because I think one of the biggest misconceptions in media and politics in Australia is that for young women, you only speak to your own demographic and you're irrelevant or exclusionary to everyone else. And actually the fact that when I do a live show or do an event of some sort, often it's 80-year-old women who are turning up and saying, I'm so excited for my granddaughters because of media like this. Like that really stimulates what I'm doing because I know that there's a thirst and I know that I can reach every demographic in Australia. Yes, it's mostly women, but I think also in part, actually, to be completely honest, that's my branding. I started with like a lilac color palette expecting that I'd only reach young women. And so now it's actually about branching out and saying, how do I bring men into the conversation too? If I've made this an inclusive space for women of all ages, I need to expand and actually reckon with myself there and how I've failed to do that so far.
And I feel like sort of algorithms can sit at the heart of a lot of this. And there can be a real tension between platforms sort of amplifying political content because it drives engagement, but then the implications that that can sometimes have on sort of the nature and tone of political discourse. And I know this might speak to some of the things that you'll be talking about at your Oxford Union debate tonight, which is very exciting. But I was hoping you might be able to tell us, from your experience as someone who works with platforms in your everyday work, how much do you think creators can push back against sort of algorithmic incentives, and to what extent do platforms architecture just went out?
This is a great question. And I don't think I've ever received a question like that before. Because honestly, I think the way that we frame this discussion is always what should consumers do, what should users do, or what should platforms do. But we fail to mention the role that people like me have in gamifying algorithms too. And I'm going to speak to it a bit tonight because I think it's really important that people like me say, I've perpetuated this. I have been a perpetrator of these issues where I've leaned into certainty and to inflammation and into political divides, because when I was 22 and operating on this platform, I made those mistakes. And it does frustrate me. It angers me now, seeing a post that I do, which is 15 slides of in-depth information, actually breaking down the history of the Middle East, tank because no one wants to engage with long-form content that actually provides nuance, versus 2 lines criticizing the Prime Minister that will get 50,000 likes and 1 million views. And I need to reckon with the fact that I need to provide quality work, but in order to grow as well, I do need to provide some, I guess sugary would be the easy word, but I would say simple content that feels easier for people to engage with if they are politically disengaged as well. And so we do talk about often like the need to insert more pop culture into politics because people are able to kind of step in. But I don't think that goes away from my goal either, which is that if you're someone who is disengaged from politics, you're a teenager, maybe you're just like in high school learning about legal studies or modern history for the first time, and you're wanting to know more about consent education, you should be able to get something from my platform. And if you are someone who is absolutely in and embedded in left-wing spaces and want to learn about prison abolition, you should also be able to be like sort of served by our content too. Operating on that spectrum and trying to represent a lot of different people who feel differently about politics is hard, because where we're at with algorithms is that people feel like their For You page should only ever express either things they absolutely agree with or absolutely disagree with. The middle space is where people just cannot sit, because what happens is if you agree with an influencer or a commentator on 90% of their views, but you really hated that one video, people unfollow them. And we actually need to be more willing to sit in the gray area of, oh, I like this person, but they say some things that challenge me. And yes, it depends on where your red line is. I want to acknowledge that. But I think that as creators too, we need to reflect on reaching new audiences, not only feeding those who already agree with us, and being willing to receive and be able to separate good feedback, tangible criticism from trolling, because I think we love to apply blankets, and that's just not going to work on social media. It never will.
I think that's such an interesting perspective on the role of influencers and creators, but I do want to also bring it back to platforms because I think we can all agree that that is a massive part of the problem as well. So tonight at the Union, you're going to be arguing for the privatization of media.
Yeah.
Could you talk us through what exactly are the policy recommendations that you would make to leaders who are maybe listening to our podcast? What needs to happen to regulate this space?
Yeah, so in Australia, we're the first in the world to regulate an under 16 social media ban. Now, that has been widely supported by the Australian community. Like, I think parents holistically think this is a good thing. I understand. As someone who grew up on social media, I would think I was on Instagram at the age of 13. The damage that does is severe. Like, I think any of us that would spend our teenage years on social media, any of us on social media right now know what it's doing to us. Like, it is a harmful space to operate in. There are benefits. I think it's a net negative. When we think about teenagers, I understand that there is a benefit to prohibition until a certain age. But I think it was a political point scoring tactic of our government to implement that strategy rather than actually trying to regulate platforms at a bigger level. And I think there's two solutions or distinct campaigns that would have been more beneficial to the entire population. The first would have been a digital duty of care, a legal obligation put on these platforms to remove disinformation. I think when we get into the territory of talking about the removal of extreme material, there is an argument for censorship, especially when we're talking about different conflicts happening around the world and what kind of content is actually only shared on social media, exposing the truth of what's happening. But I think that the second campaign that's worth mentioning too, which is probably the one I'm more supportive of, in Australia, Chanel Contos, who I know was a student at Oxford recently, she's the founder of Teach Us Consent, and she's running a campaign through Teach Us Consent called Fix Our Feeds. And that campaign is about making algorithms an opt-in. So it's giving users the power to say, I might just want the chronological feed from pre-2016. I might want to go back to the old Instagram where I'm not fed inflammatory content to keep me on this app, but I'm just engaging with the people I follow that I'm interested in. And I think those are two really interesting solutions that I would love to see governments sort of start discussing at the very least.
Mm-hmm. And how you have announced that you intend to run as an independent in the next election. Could you talk us through your thinking around that and what that would mean for Cheek Media if you're elected? And also, your decision to potentially make that transition from someone who holds power to account from the outside to then potentially being within that system.
Oh, it's obviously nerve-wracking. I think that from my perspective, I've spent 5 years doing this. I love my job. I can't express enough how seriously I take the responsibility of having so many people in Australia really look to me for their political opinions, but I also find that scary. Like, I think there are a lot of people that come up to me in public and say, oh, you're my only news source. And I say, that's the worst possible thing you could say. That's exactly what I'm advocating against. Tribal consumption of the news in any capacity is killing us, right? But I still take that weight and that commitment and that trust so seriously. But I also have spent the last 5 years commentating from the outside and critiquing government. And I think at a certain point, you need to engage from the inside or show the capacity to be interested in being part of the solution. And I don't say that to mean that any commentator or journalist is not. But I do think from a personal perspective, if my expertise is in understanding systems and communicating how to change them, break them down, look at alternatives, why not try and use that skill set beyond just yelling from the outside of the arena? Because I think that there is merit as well in trying to run a campaign and show people, young women, what that's like. It might be reputationally harmful. It might mean a lot more people very loudly dislike me. I'm willing to take that risk because I think people need to be a lot braver with how they state their beliefs, how they act on their beliefs, and how they're willing to fail publicly. My goal isn't to win. It's trying to have an impact on the women who follow me, who might be scared of politics. And I'm saying, yeah, this might go up in flames. This might be really tough. This might be embarrassing. That's okay. My goal is to have a go and to take action that I believe will give me a life that I don't regret, in a way where I'm passionate about this. I care about this. And yeah, anything could happen. And that's the most exciting part. I don't want to sit in the comfort of just posting on Instagram. I think I can take the next step and go beyond that and really set a new challenge for myself too. And I think when it comes to Cheek Media, what I'm trying to do at the moment is just build out the team so that that can be a functional business that I can step out of, because I understand that my face and identity is associated so closely with Cheek. So stepping out for a political campaign, everyone's obviously going to think like, well, it's still just kind of an arm of what I'm doing. I can't really separate that. I have no control over that. But what I can do is ensure that there's a functional team so that when I run, whatever the outcome is, that is an entity that continues on with or without me.
And I think that really perfectly brings us to my final question for you, Hannah, which is quite a big picture question, actually. So you've spent the last 5 years building Cheek, and it's clear that you've made so much impact already around Australia and the world as well. If you were to, say, in 10 years' time, look back and look at everything that Cheek has achieved, what is it that you would like to see? What is the change that you want to see in the political landscape or broader?
I think it's less about what I want to see in the political landscape. Like, obviously, I want change for our landscape. I want the two-party system to be broken down. I guess that is a big one, right? I really believe in the offering up of more voices and more challenges to the two-party system, because I think they're getting away with ripping off Australians and presenting it as good politics. But I think my biggest goal is that women in Australia feel like they're part of the conversation politically. I just worry so much about the women I engage with that have always voted like their parents or like their husband. And I really want to change the narrative. I've been interviewed on so many podcasts with influencers and businesswomen in Australia who have me on to break politics down for their followers, because they say, I'm too dumb, I just don't get politics. And I always look at these women and I've said to one before, you own a business worth $10 million. Why are you not smart enough for politics? Every facet of your life in some way is political. And the quote that I always repeat, I can't remember who the original is, but Elizabeth Warren said it a few years ago and it just went off, which is, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that just speaks to the fact that women, we've not been invited to the table, and we need to explore the intersections of exactly who's uninvited to the table and who has their fair share and all of those things. But we need to take the seat. We need to sit down and we need to start talking. And my experience and the reason I want to run is because I've now taken the seat and been sitting in it for 5 years. And I've realized the other people at the table aren't taking it as seriously. And I really want young women to feel part of the conversation, because I think what we've been made to feel like we have to exclude ourselves and we don't know enough. And my goal for Cheek is that women walk into a voting booth and feel really, really clear on their belief system and the decision that they're making and how they're going to use their voice.
Wow. Hannah, this has been such a rich and wide-ranging discussion. Thank you so much for joining Thenu and I on the Oxford Policy Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been lovely.